Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Brewtiful. I'm Anthony, and today we're going to talk about a really interesting part of craft beer's history. You know, when people think about craft beer history, and we're talking about specifically within that modern era of craft beer, you mostly think about, like it started in the early 70s and then it really boomed in the 2010s. But there was a huge growing period in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that was absolutely critical to laying down the foundation for what would eventually become the bubble or the boom, if you will. It really created some of the most iconic beer brands in existence to this day. You know, Founders, Anchor really became significant, Stone, all those guys. But what if I told you that the whole thing almost came to a screeching halt, all because of a global cataclysmic event that almost destroyed the entire craft beer industry in its infancy? Today, I want to tell you the story behind that event. Today, we're going to talk about the phenomenal, the devastating hop crisis of 2007. So the year was 2007, and craft beer had really started breaking into the mainstream. You know, of course, it was still a niche item for a niche community, but it was really starting to gain momentum. People were starting to look at it as a viable alternative to a lot of the big pale lager beer brands that still kind of dominate the market. But for many decades were pretty much the only offering that the vast majority of America had. And consumers were incredibly hop thirsty. They were wanting hops in everything. We saw a lot of traditional English and German styles come to America, be adopted, and then hopped to the max limit that they could possibly still be perceived as their original intention, their original version. And that became like the American interpretations of those styles. Additionally, American consumers really latched on to concepts like pale ales and IPAs. It became the perfect fusion between the changing of American beer drinkers' palates and a new burgeoning market. The hop craze was in its infancy, but it was sweeping through America. Isaac Newton once said that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and this event was absolutely no exception. Throughout the early to mid-90s, hop farmers and hop distributors had actually kind of lost a little bit of hope in the crop. There just wasn't enough demand for them to be able to certify themselves as like a cash crop. At this point in time, the vast majority of hops grown here in America went straight to some of the bigger brands. You know, we're talking your AB InBevs, we're talking your Millers and Coors, and there just wasn't really a craft market for niche hop varietals. Now, this actually wasn't just an American problem. This was kind of a global issue. At this point in time, big beer conglomerates were the vast majority of the market. And if that's your only major purchaser, your only major consumer, they kind of get to dictate the prices of the market. You know, it's so easy for them to be like, hey, cut me a deal here or else I'm going to go to a competitor. And so that just drove the entire agricultural aspect of the hop industry completely down. So decades of low prices compounded with a just huge downturn in the market overall created an environment where hop farmers and hop growers just weren't dedicating the same amount of acreage to their crops as they would have in other situations or other environments. They started to turn into more economically viable crops. You know, they started focusing on wheat and corn specifically. This switch from hops to cash crops actually resulted in approximately 1/4 of the entire global hop production to just completely evaporate. To make matters worse, in 2006, there was actually a devastating fire that completely destroyed huge bulk amounts of American grown hops. This little fire was absolutely devastating to the American hop market. We're talking about a complete reduction of about 4% of the entire hop crop, the entire hop reserve in the American hop market. This 4% created a huge surge in demand for what hops remained. And of course, the bigger breweries are always going to have priority because they're a stable consumer. They're a stable customer that's always going to be back, repetitive purchases. So they're going to be prioritized, right? Because of that, we saw almost nothing trickling out to these smaller craft breweries who were just trying to get on their feet. So there was automatically a massive void. So naturally, they started looking to alternative markets such as Europe and possibly Asia. But they were having their own problems that would completely prevent anyone in America from getting their hands on it. At that same point in time, over in Europe, there was a series of catastrophic atmospheric events that completely destroyed the European market as well. We saw huge floods throughout England that destroyed all those legendary, pseudo-noble English hops, just absolutely destroyed. Over in Slovenia, we saw huge hailstorms that completely destroyed the Eastern European kind of market. And in Germany, France, and Belgium, we saw the exact opposite. We saw no rainfall, which caused a lot of hops to just simply wither and die on the vine. All around the entire Western European hemisphere was just devastated, completely void of hops coming to the market. Now, as you can imagine, this created a pretty rough next couple of years for that burgeoning craft brewery industry. The average cost of a pound of hops jumped up from around $3, even for some of your hipper, craftier varietals. It shot up to a minimum of $20 a pound. That's huge. This problem was compounded even worse by the fact that how the hop market was kind of handled at that point in time. Everything was really fixed on contracts, not too different from today. But the bigger breweries, because they were those repeat, stable consumers, they were able to sign into fixed rate contracts. So no matter what happens in the industry, they're always going to get the same bulk amount of hops that they want and that they need at the same price that they signed up for at that original contract obligation. That can't be said for a lot of the newer craft breweries that were popping up here and there. They were automatically subjugated to some of the highest hop prices the world has ever seen, ever. The hop distributors, they kind of capitalized. That's a really nice way of putting it. They kind of were vultures at this point in time, and they really stuck it to these small craft breweries. They were like, okay, look, we don't have a whole lot of supply, and demand is absolutely through the roof. And honestly, we just don't have the amount of hops in reserve to be able to do onesies and twosies here. So the only way you're going to get hops is if you sign a contract like the big boys. So you have to buy in bulk, buy in long-term contracts at the fixed market price. So you saw a lot of craft breweries who were small mom and pop style businesses trying to buy hops and were being forced to buy them at $20 a pound at a minimum for 10 years. And there was no way out of it. Chip McElroy of Austin's Live Oak Brewing Company said, "We spent all our money on hops at 5 times the normal price. That really makes a dent. We'd like to buy some more kegs, but we can't." They were still subjugated to just getting what you get, even if it was at such a high premium. They were only getting the scraps and the leftover second and third choice offerings given to the big breweries. Obviously, this created a huge problem for the breweries and the consumers, because the consumers became fixated on consistency. It's hard to convince them that, hey, sometimes things are going to change based off of the yearly annual crop or this and that. They were fixated on one particular thing and they wanted that. And when you started getting these scraps and these lower grade hops, it put a huge dent on the quality of the product. So these brewers were seeing massive fall off in sales, but they basically had to make the decision, hey, we're going to have to retire some brands. We're going to have to cut down on the amount of hops used in other brands, or we're going to have to focus less on creativity and put all of whatever material we're able to get in order to keep a well-known flagship or something like that afloat. Brian Peters, the brewmaster at Uncle Billy's Brew & Q, said, "I don't have the hops of my choice, and now I can't get any of the classic citrusy hops that are real popular with the IPAs. I'm trying hops I've never used before. We're going to have to get out of our hop comfort zone." Now, anytime any business has to take on unexpected expenses or a price hike in their raw materials, you know it's always going to be pushed down onto the consumer. This situation was absolutely no different. We saw the average price of a pint of beer in America skyrocket by almost 25 to 50 cents. That's pretty big. I mean, that really adds up over time. All in all, the victims were numerous. The consumer took a fall, the hop growers took a fall, the breweries took a massive fall and loss of customers and loss of quality. It was devastating. But fortunately, we got to see something pretty cool. One of my favorite things about craft beer is the fact that we're sometimes able to pull ourselves together, overcome our differences, and really work together as like a national and even global community, all for the betterment of the industry. We really changed the way that we utilized hops. Incredibly hoppy beers were still being made, but they were drastically different than what people were used to. When you look at the global beer market at this point in time, that 2007, 2008-ish period, we saw huge IBU beers. I mean, palate wreckers, things that were just off the charts in bitterness, because that's kind of like what the American craft consumer was expecting when they drank IPAs. And when you look at a lot of the hop crops that were being grown at that point in time, they were all huge, high alpha acid hop varietals meant to give that big bitter impact. But there was another market, and that was the strong beta acid hops. A lot of hops that just weren't very bitter, but were hugely aromatic, hugely pungent, and if manipulated in the right way, could create huge, juicy, intense flavors that just were everything you wanted out of hops, minus the bitter. And this adoption of these high alpha acid hops would create a massive ripple that we are still experiencing to this day, almost 20 years later. We started seeing breweries shy away from huge IBU beers and instead focusing on really juicy, aromatic aspects, double, triple, quadruple dry hopped beers. The shift changed from the bitterness of the hop to how hoppy can I perceive it before it even touches my tongue? And that eventually snowballed into things like, the double and whatever dry hops. But we also started seeing your hazy IPAs, your New England IPAs. It just drastically changed the entire market. The entire American palate shifted in this new direction, all because a bulk supply of incredibly bitter hops went up in flames. Quite literally. If it wasn't for that Yakima fire, we might have never been so focused on the juicy aspect of hops. Now, as I mentioned, we did come together and we did work together as an industry, as a community. And there were a couple of predominant heroes that came out of this. I think the one that gets the most media attention was certainly Sam Adams. Sam Adams gave away thousands and thousands of pounds of hops at cost, at what it cost them, not at the market price, at cost. And they were giving these hops away to smaller craft breweries who might otherwise have never been able to get their hands on hops during this time period, Because of Sam Adams giving away quite literally thousands and thousands of pounds of hops, it kept so many small breweries in business. All in all, I think Sam Adams gave away around 20,000 pounds of hops to around 130, 150 different small craft breweries. And without a doubt, that was instrumental to keeping the entire industry afloat. I mean, that's huge. Now, there were people who gave away a whole lot more. I think Sierra Nevada gave away around 150,000 pounds of hops at cost prices, not market price. And I just don't think they really got the praise that they deserve. Ken Grossman, the Sierra Nevada founder, said, "Jim's much better at figuring out how to market the thing and take credit." As time went by, the pressures of the hop market really subsided, and people were able to reinvest into the hop growing industry. Once again, because of that huge price spike, hops were a cash crop, and people were really interested in building out their acreage in order to be able to meet that demand. It really showed that there is a new market, and maybe that we have been thinking too small about this. And they really started changing up how hops are grown and how they started planning for the future instead of just trying to meet demand. New brands and new varietals of hops started reaching the market, and they really started thinking about what our breweries going to want in 2 to 3 years, because that's how long it takes for a vine to become truly fruitful and offer a bountiful harvest of hops, So they had to start thinking in the future, thinking ahead of the curve. They saw how the craft beer industry was pushing towards those juicier aspects. So they started trying to develop hop breeds that would really be able to meet that demand in the future. Additionally, they started focusing on different techniques and different storage practices and everything that they could do to prevent themselves from being so susceptible to disease, to disaster, to shortages. If there is a huge abundance of different things, just because one hop is susceptible to some type of disease doesn't mean another hop is. It might be more resilient. So a more diversified crop portfolio results in a more sustainable market deliverance. That movement in the hop growing industry really helped solidify the future of craft beer, propping them up for that boom. If it wasn't for this whole cataclysmic event, we wouldn't have seen things like Citra and Mosaic and all these super hype hops that would be to come. That was a weird way to say it. We wouldn't have seen them come to market. Adventure, experimentalism, and predictability. I think it's 100% fair to say that without the 2007 hop crisis, the craft beer industry as we know it today would have been impossible. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something about not only a bit of our weird craft beer history, but a little bit about how we got to where we are today, because we are built off of our history. That's what props us up for existing in the modern era. Remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers, my friends.